I want to do a Time for All Ages, a wisdom tale today. And this is a story that comes, it's a North American story. It comes from the Indigenous tradition, but we're not actually sure which specific tribe because there's many versions of it. And it's in this area, and there's these two farmers who've been there for a long time, and they've got a piece of land between them that they kind of fight over, because they both claim that their grandfathers owned the land. But so they can't settle it. So they go and talk to the local religious leader, and they said, so who owns the land? Can you remember? He said, well, I haven't been here that long, so maybe you need to go and talk to someone else. Why don't you take it to court? So they go to the judge and they ask him, well, which one of us owns the land? I believe my grandfather owns it. And I said, no, I feel my grandfather owns it. And the judge said, well, I've got no proof either way. I'm not sure who owns it. I said, why don't you find the oldest person in the community, and they might be able to help you? And they thought, okay, who's the oldest person in the community? And it wasn't me. And so he said, I think it's Chief Noah, who lives down the street. You know, his family and his ancestors have been here forever. So they go and talk to Chief Noah, and they say, do you know who owns it? Is it this piece of land? Is it my land or is it his land? And he says, I don't know. He said, can you tell me what your stories is? And both of them relate to the stories of their ancestors crossed the country and settled in the land and claimed it. And he said, well, let's go out to the land. So Chief Noah said, you have to come with me out to the land. And he said, tell your story to the land. And they thought, what? He said, tell your story to the land, and the land will decide. So they both tell the stories, and both families had myths. They were very similar, but with little differences. And of course, because they were talking to the land, they started to exaggerate it, for their claim on it. And the chief says, I still don't know. Let me talk to the land. And so the chief gets down on his knees and starts talking to the land. He said, I need to listen to the land. And he's there for about 40 minutes, listening to the land. And the people are getting really fed up, thinking it would have been better talking to the judge than this guy. And so they would listen to the land. He says, well, the land told me many stories about who owns the land. But he says that you don't own the land owns you. And he said, you don't have any claim to this land, but because the land owns you, you need to care for it and nurture it, so you're both responsible for caring for this land and not exploiting it. So the land owns both of you. You do not own the land. And I think of that story in the sense of our seventh principle, the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are part. We often think that we own the land, we own the planet, but really we are just part of the environment. And I think it's very important when we think of environmental justice, when we think of racial justice, when we think of justice, we need to think of how we are part of an interdependent web. So thank you very much for listening. I'd like to invite you now to join me in the spirit of prayer, meditation and reflection. And this is a prayer honouring the deeper voices on this Mother's Day from my colleague, Evan Carville-Zima. Spirit of life, today the advertising tells us what to buy for Mom. Instead, help us listen to and honour the deeper voice. Today, let us honour all those who have made this world possible for us. Those who did the hard work of building a better world for future generations. Today, let us honour the grief of those who have lost children through miscarriage, stillbirth, death. Those who long for children and those, for whatever reason, cannot be in touch with their children today. Today, let us honour the grief of those who mourn for their parents, for they're separated by death, dementia, or disconnection. Today, let us honour those who fill in for missing mothering, fathers, grandparents, foster parents, aunts, uncles, and more. Today, let us honor the ways we have each been nurtured and mothered, by the mothers who gave birth to us, by the parents who raised us, by those many others who have supported and nurtured us, of all genders. Today, let us honor those who survived damaging and traumatic mothering. Spirit of life, help them to heal. Let us remember that not every mother is ready for her children. Let us turn aside from the myths of motherhood. Let us turn aside from the myths of motherhood on a pedestal and remember each parent is an imperfect human in need for more support than adulation, in need of our support. Today, let us honor those who are doing the hard work of nurturing, striving to meet not only the physical needs, but the many deep, complicated emotional and spiritual needs. Spirit of life, nurture and sustain them so that they may be the nurturers we desire. Today, let us honor all the ways each of us give to tomorrow, knowing there are multiple paths of meaning and more than one way to give birth to the future. Today, with both joy and sorrow, let us be grateful for life, for the chance to love, for those who love us, and the opportunity to nurture the future we desire. I invite you to join me in silence. Blessed be, and amen.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Brian. I'd like to start by wishing all of the mothers that are joining us today Happy Mother's Day, whether you're a mother to a human or a fur baby, or maybe you just do a lot of mothering to the people around you. I'd also like to wish a happy Mother's Day to the women who mother me. I'm fortunate to have a few, and I'm very grateful for their guidance, love, and care. When it comes to mothering, I set the bar low. I don't want my children to have too much to live up to. That's one of my classic jokes about mothering. Ever since becoming a mother, I've been ambivalent about society's expectations for living up to that title, for doing the work of care that mothers are asked to do. My brother gave me great advice about this a long time ago. He said, no matter what you do, your children will go to therapy and blame you for it. If you work, they'll say you're never home. And if you stay home, they'll say you're overbearing and around too much. So do what you want to do. This was among the best advice I ever got. And until now, I've taken that to heart. I have been the kind of mother I want to be. I've tried really hard to consider my own needs, along with the needs of my family. And until now, it's worked out pretty well. That changed dramatically 3 weeks ago. While visiting France, my daughter was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance and diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. She spent 8 days in the hospital, and I got really good at using Google Translate. We finally made it home, and Abby is doing really well. She spent last weekend at a Lord concert, and last night was her senior prom. The technology for diabetes is amazing. She now wears a continuous glucose monitor, and I have an app on my phone that shows me her blood sugar level at any time. Any time. Like even right now. Like last night when it wasn't working and she was at her prom. The fear is she'll go too low and pass out, or her sugar will be too high, and that can impact her long term if it lasts too long. Remember at the beginning of this reflection when I told you what a laissez-faire mother I am? See French there, laissez-faire. How I don't pay attention to my children and the way I put myself first and practically ignore my kids. Since Abby's diagnosis, I don't recognize myself. My mothering has totally changed. I'm checking on her all the time, bugging her about her sugar, reminding her to take her long insulin shot at night, asking her how she's doing. I've always been judgmental of mothers like that. Just leave your kids alone, they'll be fine. I think to myself when a mom shares her fears and worries. Not anymore. I'm right there with you. You might look inside your kids' closets or read their text messages. I look inside my daughter's blood. I'm not sure how much more invasive it gets than that. My job is to keep you alive. That is what I tell my kids. Until now, I always thought that was a low bar. Suddenly it isn't. My daughter is doing a great job of managing her sugar, giving herself injections, and generally taking responsibility for her health. And I can't help worrying about her, checking in with reminders and questions. And I know I'm driving her crazy. I'm driving myself a little crazy too. And I don't want this to affect our relationship, especially since she's leaving for college in the fall. It is so easy to feel like a bad mother. Like my brother said, whatever I do, her therapist is going to hear about it eventually. I have a neighbor who seems like the perfect mother. The other day she shared that being together as a whole family is really important to her, and her entire family eats dinner together every night. Every night. We don't even make dinner every night. And if I can get us around the table one night a week, that's a miracle. And yet, my children manage to feed themselves, and neither has died of starvation. Okay, one almost died, but she didn't. So there you go, low bar. And when they sit down with their future children at their dinner table, they will feel like the most amazing parents on the planet. See what I did there? I have found a way to make my shortcomings as a mother, take my shortcomings as a mother and make them a good thing. Some would call this rationalizing. I once joked that I could write a book called How to Rationalize Anything. And I really could, I'm excellent at it. And frankly, when it comes to mothering, that's a very good skill to have. So next time you need help feeling better about not feeding your children, forgetting to take them to the dentist, or sending them to school without pants. Yes, that really once happened. Give me a call. Thank you.
What? No, I discovered it. I stole that skit from a director, Oliver Stone. When I heard him speak in Berkeley many years ago, he talks about how his middle school American history class, the professor came in and did the same thing. He came in and took one of the purses from one of the students and hid it, and the person said, "Hey, you're stealing my purse." And he said, "No, I discovered it." And isn't that a brilliant way to begin American history? Because everyone knows American history began in 1492, when Columbus discovered the Americas. How you discover a place which is estimated 10 million people lived is somewhat bizarre. And I don't know if any of you know the British comedian Eddie Izzard, who's absolutely hilarious. I thoroughly recommend him. But he says that Britain developed an empire by the clever use of flags. And you go about and plant flags in places, and you go to India and plant a flag, and they said, "Hey, you can't do that. This is our country." And it's like, "Oh, have you got a flag?" And boundaries are strange things. Now, of course, the idea of discovery is interesting, but I think what we need to realize, and some of you may be aware of this, that there was a doctrine of discovery that was a papal decree in the middle of the 15th century, a papal decree being by the Pope, which essentially said that any land discovered by Christians was theirs because of the inherent inferiority of non-Christian people. Eventually, this harmful idea made its way into US law in 1823 in the Supreme Court. And it ruled, the Supreme Court reading says, the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. Now that seems, well, is that just a historical relic? It was still used in 1955 and 2005 for law. So, and it permeates our culture, this idea of discovery. How angry must Indigenous people be to hear that they have got no ownership to this land that their ancestors have lived for so long? And so that legal and religious justification for the colonization of the Americas and the subordination of the Aboriginal people of this land is deeply embedded in American and Western culture. And as the Potawatomi scientist Robin Wall Cremier says, the Indigenous idea of land as a commonly held gift was replaced with the notion of private property, while the battle between land as sacred home and land as capital stained the ground red. So I think, in that, the racism in that doctrine of discovery is just so obvious. Now, you will be pleased to hear, and some of you may have been involved with this, back in 2012, the Unitarian Universalist Association condemned the doctrine of discovery. Yet, it still permeates our culture in so many ways. And so you can see how at the very founding, pre-founding of the United States of America, there was this doctrine that made the people, the original inhabitants of the country, second-class citizens without any rights to their own land. And there was religious justification for that, just as there was religious justification for the slavery of black Africans in this culture. The earth as property had religious justification, and people as property had religious justification, because every state in the Confederacy, when they seceded from the Union, used Christian scripture as justification. And our movement's not immune from it as well. While some of our Unitarian ministers in the Boston areas were strong abolitionists, many of the congregants there, earned their money from tobacco and from textiles. And when it came to their religious values and their economic interests butting heads, guess which one won? Their economic interests. And I'm not immune from it as well. Yeah, I grew up in Glasgow, but there's an area in Glasgow that's become this hip and expensive area to live now called Merchant City. The people there were tobacco merchants. So you imagine that trade from tobacco from Britain down to West Africa for slaves, slaves to the Caribbean, and then the triangle back where they brought the tobacco back to Glasgow. And I was pleased a few years ago when the University of Glasgow decided to do reparations because of some of the money that was given to them. And they gave £21 million, which is about $30 million, to the University of the West Indies for a joint project. I think that's a good start, but it's really not enough. So there's this, the thing that's common between slavery and the commonality between, the abuse of the planet is that objectification. We don't see how we can be in a healthy relationship with the planet or with people of color. We see it as an object, like how can they be of use to me? And I think they both have the same fundamental problem. So what do we do about it? Which story do we tell ourselves? We talk about the discovery of America. And stories have multiple perspectives, and I want to tell you the story, I think I've mentioned it to you before, the story of the Exodus in the Hebrew scriptures, where It's a story where Moses leads the Hebrew slaves from captivity of the Egyptians. They wander the wilderness for 40 years and they enter Canaan. And that story has been hugely inspirational to African Americans as they seek emancipation from slavery and for the civil rights movement. The Native Americans, the Indigenous people, look at that story and they see the Canaanites. They see a conquest story. And both stories are valid. Both stories are valid. And I think that's the work I would like to do in this congregation about multiculturalism. Can we see stories? Can we see the myths we tell ourselves from more than one perspective? I think there's a richness in that. I think there's a richness for spiritual growth. I think there's a richness for understanding the human condition when we can understand more than one perspective in the stories. The story of the discovery of Columbus discovering America. There's a number of different stories in that. And that's why I think it's vital that we bring an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens to our environmental work. Because too often environmental justice has caused severe harm to Indigenous people, to people of colour. Because people of colour and Indigenous people bear the brunt of the environmental impact. Coal-fired power stations are often in the most marginalised communities. Petrochemical plants are often in the most marginalised communities. Think of Flint, Michigan, with a water crisis. From 2014 to 2019, it took 5 years for them to have drinkable tap water. Would that happen in this neighbourhood? I don't think so. Flint, Michigan is 57% African American. And 40% of the population live below the poverty line. And when you read the environmental perspective of many people of colour activists, they talk about air and water pollution, not being able to breathe, not being able to drink water. Global warming is of equal concern. Whereas if you read many of the environmental writings of white activists, climate change is the number one priority. And I think of that not being able to breathe. I can't help thinking of Eric Gardner. His last words as he was being arrested by the police, "I can't breathe." That takes up so much more significance to African Americans who live in communities where they're not able to breathe the air. The Latina activist Elizabeth Pierre, who criticizes the mainstream environmental movement when she says it was built by people who cared about conservation, who cared about wildlife, who cared about trees and open space, but didn't care about black people. And I saw this firsthand in Austin, where there was the displacement, for environmental reasons in Austin, and it led to a huge displacement of the African American community, which pretty much doesn't exist now after the 12 years I lived in Austin. So one of the keys by bringing an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens to our environmental work is that we want to be in partnership with communities of colour. We want to take leadership of communities of colour in environmental issues because they are at the front line, they are the most impacted, and they know what they need. And it's up to us to support them. And I've made the mistakes. When I was back in Austin, I founded an Interface Environmental Network, a local group, with another Presbyterian minister and a rabbi. It sounds like a joke, like the rabbi, the Presbyterian minister, and the Unitarian Universalist minister. But we did found an Interfaith Environmental Network. And we did a lot of work, and we were trying to get this coal-fired plant shut down that was in this neighbourhood, predominantly Latino neighbourhood. And we were working closely, and we could never get the Catholic Church to work with us on it. And the Catholic Church was pretty active in a lot of environmental issues, and some of it was because if you closed down the coal-fired plant, then it was going to up utility prices, and they were certainly concerned about that. But they used the reason of the preferential option for the poor, that we couldn't raise the utility prices for those in the margins. And to be honest, I don't think we took that seriously enough as leaders. And we eventually closed down the coal power plant, but we could have done it a lot sooner if we had connected with the community there, connected with those impacted them, got them on the sides of the Latino community, and we never did. And that was our mistake, and that's my learning from that. We have to partner with the groups most impacted. And Hopkins said in the reading that Kay said, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones, you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people, and you can't have disposable people without racism. Now, Hopkins, we have actually been trying, a social action committee along with UUSM's social justice group, we're trying to get Hopkins to come and speak today, but sadly, it didn't happen. And that's why we're talking about this environmental justice and racial justice, of why we need to bring them together. But the idea of disposable people, that goes right against our belief as Unitarian Universalists about the inherent worth and dignity of all people. But I think environmental justice needs to include racial justice because too many of our most marginalized citizens have immediate short-term needs. Yeah, they're worried about climate change just as much as you and I, but they're worried about getting drinking water, they're worried about getting clean air, they're worried about the criminal justice system that discriminates against themselves, and they're worried if they've got enough food to eat. And those short-term priorities conflict with the concerns about climate change. If you look at the statistics, there's a higher percentage of Latino and African Americans care about climate change than white people. Yet our environmental movement is mainly led by people who identify as white. It's because they have to work on all these other justice issues, and they've, like all of us, they've only got so much time and energy. I think what we really need to do as a community is look at where's the intersection of racial justice and environmental justice that we can work on. Because if we can find those pivot points of intersections, we can have more influence. So that we don't have this separate group that's working in racial justice and this separate group that's working in environmental justice. Where can we find the overlap? Where can we find the overlap between immigration justice and racial justice? Find the overlap. What about voting rights and racial justice? Where's the overlap? Find those pivot points, the intersections, and we can have more influence. Can we partner with people? Can we take leadership of people of colour who are leading in this? That's what I think we should be doing as a movement. And we've seen some of that, even in the short time I've been here, with the work we've done with Faith in Action. We've been doing community organising, where we've been taking leadership of the Latino groups in Redwood City. And it's rich work. It's slow work. It's learning work, because we need to build relationships. We need to build relationships of trust. We need to build relationships of accountability. But we need to build relationships of common interest, because they're there. And we're learning. You know, the Dakota pipeline, where it was the Standing Rock Sioux, many white activists, including many Unitarian Universalists, went there and took leadership from the Indigenous people there. Because I don't think you can really have environmental sustainability without justice. It seems obvious, but we can't have environmental sustainability unless it's just, and the process of how we do the work is just as important as the end and the outcomes. By bringing in people together, and I've mentioned before the idea of reverse utilitarianism, where we want to reduce the most suffering for the most number of people, and by doing that you need to connect with those who are most suffering and work with them, like, how can we support you in relieving your suffering? And the intersection of environmental justice really does bring our first and seventh principle together. Our first principle, which is the inherent worth and dignity of all people, which for me is a strong call to support and prioritize those most marginalized in our society. And our seventh principle, which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence. I think that's a huge call for environmental justice. So when you put your first and seventh principles together, that's saying bring that racial justice lens to our environmental work. I'd like to finish with a quote from the Jewish Talmud. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Walk humbly now. Do justly now. Love mercy now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it.